What's going on, y'all? Shout out to the LDPC, it's your boy Fight Critic, and welcome to episode 3 of the Rise and Fall of Golden Boy Promotions. Thank you to everybody who's been able to watch episodes 1 and 2. I'll put both episodes in the description of part 3. But this right here, is I've been waiting to make this one because this is where a lot of people who, especially that jumped into the game, more frequently, they know this time period. So I'm really happy to touch on what's going on right here. Because this part 3 right here, this is where shit gets crazy. Not as crazy as, what we're gonna see in 4 and 5. But this right here, this is where Golden Boy goes from being a promotional company that's, they got a couple names and are doing well, to right to the fucking top. And there's one man who deserves a lot of credit for that. And that is not Oscar De La Hoya. That is none other than, and at that time, pretty boy Floyd Mayweather. 2007 was a big year for boxing. Probably the biggest year for boxing, especially because as we went in through the early 2000s, you started to see a decline in the heavyweight division. And you have to realize this is very important because it plays into this time period. Because without a prominent American heavyweight, there are so many guys under the heavyweight division that they're looking to be the marquee name that carries the sport. And when Oscar De La Hoya comes back into the sport, well, there's a new sheriff in town, and his name is Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather goes into 2007 undefeated, virtually flawless, and to make matters, very, very more defined, he is officially and without any doubts the best fighter in the sport. There is nobody in 2007 that you could put on the same level of Floyd Mayweather. Not even Manny Pacquiao at the time. Pacquiao's going to come a little bit later, but not even Manny Pacquiao at the time. But at this time, Floyd Mayweather is the best fighter, bar none. And he's coming off of what looks like an impressive year in 2006. He dismantles Zab Judah across 12 rounds and then fights the man that beat Judah when Judah was undisputed welterweight champion in Carlos Baldomir. And in doing those two things, Floyd sets himself up for the fight against De La Hoya. Now, I could jump directly into De La Hoya versus Mayweather, but I also have to set up who is Floyd Mayweather and what makes this fight with Oscar to be so defining for both these guys in their careers. So Floyd Mayweather, as you know, comes from Grand Rapids, Michigan, is the son of Floyd Mayweather Sr., who at the time is training Oscar De La Hoya. So there's a little bit more of a personal, thing about this fight. But what makes this fight so compelling is the fact that Floyd and Oscar were both signed to Top Rank. And for Floyd, much like with other fighters who are coming out of the Olympics, unlike Oscar, who got the gold medal, Floyd ended up getting a bronze medal. And he got a bronze medal, albeit only because he got screwed out of the gold medal. And he got screwed out of the gold medal match so horribly that the official who judged the fight against him had to resign. And for Floyd, he made it his business that he would never find himself in a position to where he would allow something that was so sure of that was his to be taken away from him. So becoming an amateur was one really good step. Floyd was a very decorated amateur. He was amazing as an amateur fighter. Had won the National Golden Gloves. Had won a national title, had been to different international competitions, and he was seen as the best American fighter going in to the Olympics in '96. But leaving the Olympics, a little bit shorthanded. Yes, he medaled, but it wasn't really where you would consider yourself to be, considering where you were going in. But for Floyd, he racks up impressive win after win after win as a professional. He's building steam. He's becoming a marquee name. But what, in my opinion, is the standout for him is the fact that he eventually, as the time grows and he's being trained by his father, he gets his first world title fight against Gennaro Hernandez, a man whose only loss at the time, I believe, comes at the hands of Oscar De La Hoya at a weight class up. And Gennaro Hernandez moves back down to the super featherweight division and wins a title there, becomes a really good champion, somebody who you can say at that time was one of the best super featherweights of his era. And then Floyd Mayweather, who is not even ranked in the top 5 for Gennaro Hernandez's WBC title, gets a title shot. And for many people, this is very, very intriguing. Floyd is not seen to be as an overwhelming favorite against Hernandez. He's favored to win, but the gap is not really big. He's only like a slight favorite, to beat Gennaro. And Floyd goes in there and he puts on one of the most masterful performances for a fighter fighting his first world title fight against a very established and a very, very good champion with a really good resume. And he forces Gennaro Hernandez to quit on his stool. And for many people, this was kind of bizarre. We never really expected him to make a guy like Gennaro Hernandez quit on his stool, but he does. And Floyd carries that momentum into a fight against Angel Manfredi, knocks out Manfredi in 2 rounds, one of the more popular fights on his resume. And he starts racking up super featherweight win after win after win. And then comes the first fight that Floyd is not picked to win, which is Diego Corrales. Corrales is not only ranked ahead of Floyd in the super featherweight division, but he's ranked higher than him pound for pound. And for Floyd, this is the marquee matchup that he's been looking for, that people have doubts about, that people think Corrales is just going to go in there and knock Floyd out, that he's too big, he's not slow, and I should say not slow instead of being super fast, because Corrales isn't like a super fast fighter, but he's not slow, he's not a guy that wastes his punches, and at the same time, people feel that he's just naturally going to be too big, too strong for Floyd. Floyd is working with anywhere from a 3 to 4 different height difference in terms of a disadvantage, anywhere from a 3 to 4 inch, reach disadvantage. And Floyd absolutely dominates Diego Corrales, knocking him down 5 times. And then Floyd finds himself moving up to lightweight. And there's where you find the first and only real discrepancy in Floyd Mayweather's resume, which is the Jose Luis Castillo fights. And in the first fight, Floyd Mayweather seemed to be in control for roughly the first 6 rounds. But after round 2, you hear Floyd in his corner say that something's wrong with his shoulder. And this was a shoulder problem that had plagued him previously before he moved up to the lightweight division. I believe his only official knockdown is because he threw a shot that was so hard that it caused a nerve in his back to pinch, and he took a knee over it as just a freak reaction. And that was actually only knockdown of Floyd Mayweather's career. Floyd has never been officially put down, since. But for Floyd, going into the Castillo fight, he wins the Castillo fight on a very, very slim decision. I believe the decision was either split or majority or a slim unanimous decision. I have to go back and look at those scorecards. But for Floyd, there is a hanging of a little bit of doubt that people have. Is he really cut out to make it? And then comes the rematch, and Floyd silences all the doubters in the rematch. And in fact, now that I think about it, and it's all kind of coming back to me, the second fight was actually scored closer than the first fight. And Floyd was actually more dominant in the second fight as comparison to the first fight. So Floyd goes in and he wins that fight. And then he carries, on, and he continues on into the remainder of the lightweight division before he moves up to super lightweight to fight Arturo Gatti, another marquee matchup against a guy who has been a former foe of Oscar De La Hoya. And Floyd essentially completely batters Arturo Gatti over 6 rounds, captures his 3rd division title, and then moves up to the 154-pound weight class. And in that 154-pound weight class, he sees the marquee matchup as Zab Judah. Zab Judah at the time is the undisputed champion in that division, but ultimately Zab Judah has to fulfill a mandatory for the WBC. And he fights Carlos Baldomir, a guy who many people just expected Judah to just beat. And Judah is so confident that he signs the Floyd Mayweather fight before he actually fights Carlos Baldomir. And Carlos Baldomir, being the challenger, can't afford to pay a sanctioning fee for every title that is on the line in this fight. So Baldomir only chooses to pay the sanctioning fee for the WBC. Now, what this means is that should Zab Judah lose, his WBA title would essentially be stripped from him and be made vacant. And for the IBF title, Zab Judah was able to keep that title because he ends up losing to Carlos Baldomir. And that forces Floyd versus Judah to be restructured in a way that allows Floyd to fight Judah. I think Judah lost a little bit of money off the top of this fight because he lost, two titles. And Floyd goes into the Judah fight, and despite Judah having great success in the first 4 rounds, Zab Judah turns into Zab Judah, and which is he begins to slow down, he begins to fade, and then he gets frustrated and he does something stupid. And then he hits Floyd with a blatant low blow, and he follows it up with a second one, and that forces a mass rush to the ring of different trainers and different fighters fighting each other. Law enforcement is in the ring, and then ultimately you just look in the corner and you see Floyd Mayweather just chilling. And it made sense for him to keep that composure because Zab's fighting Floyd's trainer, Roger Mayweather at the time. And Yoel Judah is fighting, Leonard Ellerbe, and guys are going back and forth. And the only person who's calm in the situation is Floyd. He's standing in a corner because he's like, we're going to fight after this. And I'm not about to do all of this to just get kicked out of this fight. So Floyd manages to stay calm and composed. Everybody clears himself out of the ring. And then Floyd just starts to dismantle Judah for the remainder of the fight, winning a unanimous decision. Then steps in and pitches a shutout against Baldomir. And that sets him up for the fight against De La Hoya. But leading into the Baldomir fight, Floyd had to settle a dispute with Arum in which they were at odds around his contract. Floyd wanted to fight Oscar De La Hoya. And he had made it known to Top Rank. He had made it known to a lot of people that he wanted the De La Hoya fight. And Bob Arum would not give him the De La Hoya fight. And it was so blatant that when Floyd was getting ready to go into the Judah fight, he was up for a renewal. And the renewal that Bob Arum offered him, he offered him a 3-fight renewal contract. And it's really a 2-for-1 with a 1 additional top. But Floyd wanted it to be a 3-for-1. So he would get 3 fights in and he would get an additional fight. So that's kind of interesting that Arum wanted to do a 2-for-1, or what we would call a 1-for-2. So what that meant was Arum's original proposal was Floyd would get paid to fight Antonio Margarito. And then, should he win that fight, he would be getting Miguel Cotto and Ricky Hatton. Even though all these guys aren't signed under Arum, it would be very easy for Arum to negotiate a fight for Ricky Hatton to be made. And he had already had Miguel Cotto signed under Top Rank. And he offered Floyd $10 million to fight Margarito. And the follow-up fights would be something around a $6 to $8 million range for both fights individually. And Floyd countered Arum's proposal. Floyd wanted a 3-for-1, or what you could call a 2-for-1, a 1-for-2-for-1. So Floyd was perfectly fine with fighting Margarito for the $10 million. That fight was not a discrepancy for him. But he felt that there was a discrepancy for the Miguel Cotto and Ricky Hatton fights, and he wanted $10 million apiece as well to fight those two guys, because those two guys were more popular than Margarito at the time. And Ricky Hatton had already started to build a name for him overseas, so it would make a lot of sense. And those two guys were at the Arturo Gatti fight. Miguel Cotto was seen to be the Puerto Rican, Gotti. And for Ricky Hatton, he just got done obliterating Costa Zoo. So it made a ton of sense for Floyd to try to get the top dollar to fight these two guys. But ultimately, Floyd wanted that Oscar fight, and he wanted the Oscar fight for $25 million. And Arum said he would never get that type of money. And he would never get the money that he would want from the the Oscar De La Hoya fight. So they scratched those talks. And for Floyd, he moved away from wanting to do business with Arum, buying out his contract for $750,000, which for Floyd Mayweather now is like pennies, but back then it's a lot of money for a guy who was making somewhere around $5 to $6 million a fight. So for Floyd Mayweather, he declines the contract renewal, buys his contract out, and then he fights Baldomir as an official free agent working with Golden Boy. And he makes $12 million for the Baldomir fight. And for Arum at the time, which is amazing because revisionist history loves to tell you that Floyd Mayweather ducked Antonio Margarito, Arum is on the record in 2006, letting everybody know in the boxing world that Floyd Mayweather was perfectly fine with fighting Antonio Margarito, but they just couldn't agree on the future fights. And Bob Arum would say differently now, but you can find that article from that year of Arum talking about what fell apart for him and Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather then carries the Baldomir, that sort of, momentum into De La Hoya. And the De La Hoya Mayweather fight is still a top 5 grossing selling fight of all time because Floyd Mayweather has won up this fight on a consistent basis. But also with the De La Hoya fight came what the expectation was for us as boxing fans into what we look at the sport for what it is now, which is 2 of the best fighters fighting in the best opportunity for these guys to give the best fight to the fans so that everybody's happy, everybody makes money, and the fans are happy. We don't get this type of environment anymore just because of time preferences. But for Oscar De La Hoya, he knew that his window was slowing down. And for Floyd Mayweather, he knew that this was the right moment for him. He was 30 years old. He's undefeated. He's a 4-division champion, and he has the opportunity to be a 5-division champion, but also to beat Oscar De La Hoya. And that's super important for Floyd Mayweather because he knows that there is a market for him to capitalize off this to get that $25 million that he wants. And for a lot of people, they're figuring out the dynamics in terms of what's the money going to look like. We know they're going to fight at the MGM Grand. We know they're going to fight on Cinco de Mayo weekend. We know all these things. But we also need to talk about what Floyd Mayweather was going up against in this fight. Floyd Mayweather not only had to sign a contract with Oscar De La Hoya's Golden Boy promotion that made him exclusive to the promotional company, he also had to fight at Oscar's weight class that he chose. He had to fight with 10-ounce gloves, and not gloves that are considered to be puncher's gloves, but he had to fight with heavyweight gloves. And when you analyze how heavyweight gloves are actually constructed, the padding in the material is so thick and dense that it doesn't even allow you to feel much of your shots when you're actually throwing them. And Oscar De La Hoya preferred those gloves. So Oscar De La Hoya made Floyd Mayweather wear 10-ounce heavyweight gloves. Oscar De La Hoya chose the venue. He chose the smallest ring size that he could because Floyd was faster than him. And Oscar De La Hoya picked the judges that he want, he picked the referee that he want, and he picked the financials that he wanted. I believe this was somewhat of a 70-30 split that was in Oscar De La Hoya's favor. Oscar De La Hoya would make somewhere north of about $55 million compared to Floyd Mayweather, who's going to make $24 million. And then the following upside to both guys would see Oscar De La Hoya net close to around $80 million. Floyd would net close to around $40 million. So Oscar was going to make double the amount of money that Floyd was going to make. And for Floyd to be against the judges, to be against the referee, to be against the climate, to be against the dynamics of it, fighting in a smaller ring with heavier gloves at a weight class you have never fought before, Floyd Mayweather beats Oscar De La Hoya. And he beats him by a slim, definitive margin. And for a lot of people, they love to go back to that fight because they like to score that fight with as much of a lens on Oscar as possible. But the fact remains that Floyd Mayweather, at some point in the middle part of the fight, he knows that he has to step on the gas. And for Oscar De La Hoya, I believe after 6 rounds, he might have been winning. This was prototypical Oscar at some point around rounds 4 and 5. And then you start to see Floyd Mayweather take things up a notch. He stops being the type of fighter who is looking to catch Oscar, and he begins to become on the offensive. So he starts to tag Oscar with short single shots. And the reason why he's hitting Oscar with these short single shots is because he knows defensively he can parry Oscar's flurries. And that's what he spends the majority of the fight doing. He parries Oscar's flurries, and then he starts to hit Oscar with straight right hands. And at one point in the fight, he looked like he was trying to get Oscar out of there. And then, of course, we go to the 12th round, and the 12th round pretty much ends with Oscar De La Hoya taking that 12th round, but it being too late for him to actually win a scorecard, in my opinion. Now, Oscar officially wins a scorecard 7 rounds to 5, but he loses the 2 other scorecards, 7 rounds to 5 and 8 rounds to 4. And for Floyd Mayweather, he has achieved what he has set out to do since 1999, which is beat Oscar De La Hoya, beat him on the biggest stage. But he not only beat him in the ring, but he beat him outside the ring. He trash-talked Oscar. He outsold this fight more than Oscar. Floyd Mayweather is the reason why that fight did the numbers that it did. The record pay-per-view buy was the reason why it did that. And for Floyd, he sees this as an opportunity for him to carry the mantle and to push things forward. And granted, for Floyd, he does take a little bit of a brief retirement from the sport, because he does so after fighting Ricky Hatton. But Floyd does come back to carry this company into the next episode. But we're not done here just yet, because there's so much that happens in 2007 to 2012 that needs to be touched on.